Okay, we're trying out some differences on the sound system, and we don't know if it's going to work or not. At any rate, when we get into the speakers program, part of the program, Courtney has said that he will try to do without this. And so if you can't hear, let us know, and we'll take some evasive action. But anyhow, he thinks he's got the power here to project, so I'm not one to doubt that now. We are working on the possibility of a sound system in this particular room, and I don't think we have anything to announce yet, so we won't do that. We do have some interesting programs coming up, though, and I think you'll find them really very interesting.
It still works. It still works. Sold.
This wasn't meant to be a comedy program, but
It's a good thing, because normally I do a single.
you do something. I'm opening for you tonight. At any rate, the July program, July 2nd, we have Jane Tracy, who is a historian of the town of Onondaga, who is going to come to and talk to us about the Onondaga County Poorhouse, the place that you may have been told you could end up there, but you didn't. I'd like to thank Bill and Joanne Casey, because they put a lovely picture of this in the newsletter. If you saw it, you saw the following information, that the poorhouse was built as far back as 1827. This was the safety net. The people that really needed help, couldn't make it otherwise, needed help, and were able to go. They had an addition put on in 1854. I guess that business was pretty good. And then in 1860, a year before the Civil War began, in 1860, this picture you'll see in the newsletter showed that they built the first Onondaga County insane asylum. Now, that must have been good business too, because in 1868 they built a second building for the insane asylum. We don't use those words anymore, but I remember my first course in psychology, we took a trip to one of these mental health facilities and toured it. And close to where I lived in South Chicago, there was one in Manteno, one in Kankakee, and we kids enjoyed teasing each other about going there. At any rate, she'll be talking about the poorhouse. Coming up August 6th, I think a very special meeting, because the Fabius Fire Department is putting together a program. And as you know, we owe these people so much. We appreciate their dedication, hard work, and devotion. Does anyone know how well that program is going? Have we heard anything?
No.
Nothing?
I know they're working on it.
Is there somebody we should shake up or talk to?
It's work in progress, and they've called me 2 or 3 times for some
Yeah.
information, so I think they're working on it.
Will they need any help of any sort?
Well, I can check.
Okay, thank you. Coming up in September, a very different kind of program. Steve Jones, some of you may know him. For many years, he was teaching music at the high school near Cortland, Freeville, I think it was. And then he was in the financial business as a financial advisor. He's an excellent singer. He's an excellent pianist. He's a professional clarinet player. I think he's given up that. But he offered to give a program on kind of history and music. And what he's going to do is talk about the music of Aaron Copland. Now, so I said to Steve, I said, I've always thought of Copland as you sit and listen to this wonderful classical music, which maybe has American themes and relates to American history, but does it have any words? Well, he showed me a book. Copland apparently wrote what Steve calls kind of character pieces. And they all have a historical origin. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And Steve, as a musician, is just a real perfectionist, very skilled. He's got a fine pianist, that he has found to help him do this, and she's an adjunct at both Syracuse University and Cortland State. So that's coming up, not the first Monday in September, because of course that's Labor Day, but the second Monday is September 10th, so you don't want to miss all of that. Well, tonight, very special. Man over here, Courtney Tucker. I think you all know him. I heard that. Oh, you already once won. Yes.
The band concert is next Tuesday.
Whoa, yes. Thank you. Band concert. It's in the Apelia Fire Station next Tuesday. What time is it?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. You came last year, you loved it, come back.
Bring a chair.
Oh yeah, bring a chair if you like to sit. You know, the Queen didn't sit. She went to the racetrack and stood up for 3 hours. Anyway, she's only 87. We have Steve here who's going to talk to us about the Fabius soldiers in the Civil War. He said he was going to talk about kind of the Civil War in general, then get specific about people here. What did they do? How did they get involved in these things? Courtney has a lot of military experience of his own, and so he knows what he's talking about, folks. Graduate of University of Washington, where he was part of the Naval Reserve's Officer Training Corps.
Who just won the national championship in crew. There are
Okay.
5 races for the national championship. The big one's the Grand Eight. For the first time in history, the University of Washington, going back to the 19th century, won all 5 championship races. No other school's ever done that.
There you have it. He graduated, was a second lieutenant, served in the Marine Corps, tank platoon leader, and you were deployed to the Caribbean. Oh, poor baby. Oh. You know, the rest of us have to pay to go there.
Yeah, I did that so that I could come up behind the back of the VC.
Way back.
So by 1973, he was the captain. He had 10 years of experience, and he's also been in this area very active in Civil War groups. And Courtney, we welcome you and look forward to your talk.
I'm delighted to be here because this happens to be one of my favorite topics. I was assigned this topic by a power greater than any other power on earth, my mother-in-law. She said, I need to find out about my great-great-grandfather, Jacob Jacoby, who was in the Civil War. So I said, yes, ma'am. I had already gotten similar marching orders from my Aunt Grace, who was the greatest woman ever to live, and she had assigned me to find out about Uncle Ben, who was also in the Civil War. In the process of doing all this, I found out that I have 22 relatives that fought for the South in the Civil War, including 18 from Virginia, 3 from North Carolina, and 3 from Texas. I have 1 federal soldier from the 6th Indiana Cavalry, but his name was Thomas Jefferson McIntosh. So if you're going to have only 1 Northern general, 1 Northern soldier, that's pretty good, Thomas Jefferson McIntosh. But my Southern relatives were Benjamin Franklin Kidd, Oliver Perry Slusher, George Washington Kidd, and with 2 or 3 other Revolutionary War heroes. There were 2 Francis Marions, 1 a Kidd, 1 a Slusher. So they believed in naming their children in the 19th century after noted Americans, because it's a big deal to be an American in this century and in the last one, but in the 19th century it was an even bigger deal. Which leads us to this gentleman right here, who was put in place in, I think, 1905. The town of Fabius had a choice of building a monument for the Civil War soldiers or doing extra things for the school and a couple of other infrastructure projects around town. And they voted unanimously, well, a lot of them voted for it anyway, I can't say unanimously, to put in the statue because it meant so much to them. And You'll be seeing why if this works. I always like to begin with today. First of all, it's 150 years since the Civil War, and I could have put sesquicentennial up there instead of 150 years, but then I'd have to spell it, and you would all have to recognize what it meant, which is a big problem. I don't want to put anybody in pressure. The Battle of Fair Oaks was on the dates as you see, a 2-day battle, almost just a shade shade more than 150 years ago. 35 units from New York participated. They formed a huge section of the Union Army. The casualties were 2,117 men. The most significant event was that General Lee replaced General Johnston in the battle because General Johnson had the good sense to get wounded over here and be carried off the field, and Lee, who was his military advisor, sort of kind of chief of staff, deployed to the field to pick up the pieces and proceeded to win the battle. Now, I put this up here because I want you to see 2 or 3 things. First of all, battles are very complicated. Each one of these regiments in here, this is Birney's brigade of 4 regiments. It's about 4,000 men, so you're talking, you look at this real quick, and all of a sudden you realize that there's 10, 20, 30,000, 40,000 men involved in one battle, and they're all trying to shoot each other. They're all trying to, at this point, take the ground because the Union Army was pushing south towards Richmond at this time. Now, the other problem with these battles is that most of them were fought in Virginia. Now, that meant a lot of things, but one of them meant that you would have to learn how to pronounce words like, right up here, Chickahominy. The Chickahominy River. And you can have the Rappahannock River, the Rappahannock River, the Potomac River is really, but you get down here in central and southern Virginia, and they start having rivers that have names with 20 or 30 letters. So it gets to be very complicated there as well. I had 2 or 3 relatives that were under General Rhodes, and I had 2 under General Pickett, both of whom made and survived Pickett's charge, which is pretty frightening right there. Now this gives you an idea of what the Peninsula Campaign was all about. That ran really from early April until June the 1st, 1862. And this had a big effect upon Fabius, believe it or not, and upon the progress of the war. We had gone through the first year of the war with only 1 or 2 battles, the first Manassas being the one that you all recognize. And McClellan decided to do a big envelopment movement, not unlike the one that I did with my tanks to come up behind the VC, except he actually landed and was able to do something, which is more than I can say. We landed a lot of troops down here and got stuck down in a siege at Yorktown, the same Yorktown, same location. Some of the guys were in the forts that the British held and the Americans took them away from in the Revolutionary War. They fortified this whole area here. You can see a number of battles earlier in March, of course, it was the Monitor and the Merrimack. But at Yorktown, what was significant about that is we had farmers from central New York and Pennsylvania, Vermont, who had lived in the north their entire life. So they go down south to Virginia. And what happens in Virginia in April? Well, it starts to get hot, but it's the insects and the swamp microbes and all kinds of other things of that nature. And in the case of the 61st New York, which I'll talk a lot about today, there was about 750 men that were in the 61st New York at the beginning of the war, and the commander wrote in an official report after this siege that he had only about 375 to 380 men left fit for duty because they were all sick. Now, in the case of my mother's great-great-great-grandfather, Jacob Jacoby, and a cousin by the name of Gurdon Hurlbert, who's related to the Schlick family and came down from up from Tyler. Both of them got sicker than dogs. And they ended up being in the hospital for some point of time. Gurdon was not able to recover, so he was discharged later on in 1862. But Jacob Jacoby stayed in the hospital from literally May the 2nd, so he's down there for a month. May the 2nd until September the 19th. That's significant because he managed to miss all the battles in the 7 days. The Second Manassas Campaign, the Chantilly battle, and he missed. He came back 2 days after the Battle of Antietam. When I tell you about the 61st New York, Gurdon and Jacob were both in the 61st New York, you'll see why that was a big deal. By the way, most of the 7 days battle we'll get to next was fought northeast of Richmond, like right up around here, around in this area, on this side of the Chickahominy River. I'm going to show you a map later on, and you're going to say, Courtney, that's wrong because it doesn't show that on the map. Well, for some reason, this guy in the next map decided to make east point up. So it gets a little confusing the first 16 times it took before I realized what the problem was. Little touch on our history. You're all familiar with all of these wars that we fought. The most significant fact, which is getting worse in this list, is that the Civil War took more soldiers than basically World War I and World War II combined, along with the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. The Battle of Shiloh took place in 1862, and after the Battle of Shiloh, after the Battle of Shiloh, there were more casualties in that battle than had occurred in all the wars up to that date. And let me think about this for a second. No, these are killed figures. That's the frightening thought. One thing I wanted to point out, I almost skipped over it. There's a little asterisk up here, a new information that just came out. A fellow down in SUNY Binghamton has done a really remarkable study. It's remarkable for several reasons, but one of them is that he wrote an article for a journal that doesn't pay anybody to write for it, and they thought it was so good, they gave him an award, which they give to one article a year, and he got a $1,000 award for doing this research. Now this man is courageous, because what he does is he analyzes census data, so he's like a demographic historian, and he's done some juggling and done some figuring, and he thinks that this number at minimum is 730,000 dead, and maybe as many as 820,000. While all these other numbers are not going to change very much. So, we are still figuring out the total cost of the Civil War to us and to our families. Again, Shiloh, 23,000 casualties, more casualties at Shiloh than at all previous battles and all previous wars. Second Manassas was a campaign that actually lasted 2 days before that. Antietam was the largest number of casualties and the largest number of killed in any war that we've ever fought in one day. And you'll notice that Gettysburg is up here. 51,000 is the biggest campaign. One could argue that the Gettysburg campaign started on June the 28th, 29th, and ran till July the 4th, maybe even July the 6th. So it depends on when you count and how you count. Anytime you see a number that says this is the number of people that were killed or wounded or whatever, including traffic statistics and everything else, you've got to know how they're measuring. More than likely, these are just very, very, very good estimates, because we're always finding out new information, and it depends on how you count it. Here's a group of Civil War facts just to consider. As you can see, the North population was 5-2 in favor of the North versus the South. In this Southern population, they counted 3.5 million black slaves, but those 3.5 million black slaves stayed at home to work the farms, work the fields, milk the cows, take care of the chickens, and feed the families, while the men went away to war. So the flip side of that argument is they didn't have as many men, but they had more actual fighting men going out because the North had to stay home and run the factories and serve as bank clerks. Very important. One of the reasons why the South was very upset about the whole Civil War and all of the things that ran up to it for 40 years before that was it meant that they had a smaller population. And they had fewer members in the House of Representatives, which meant they were not able to effect changes that they wanted, and they weren't able to block changes as they could do today of things that they didn't want. 1861, New Orleans was the largest city in the South, with only 160,000 people. Kind of an interesting thought. You never would have thought New Orleans would be that. 25% of the Southern population held slaves. The vast majority of them were just a few. Only 12% had 12 or more slaves, and then probably about half of that had 100, 200, 300 slaves, the big plantations that we've seen and Gone with the Wind and shows like that. When the war started in 1861, 300,000 men volunteered both in the North and in the South. Everybody just volunteered right at the start. There was no need for a draft because everybody was going. In fact, they couldn't supply most of the men half the time. When somebody did volunteer, they ended up signing up for 3 years, or maybe half of them for a year down in the South. That got knocked off in 1862 when the South had the first draft because they didn't have quite enough men. And then you start seeing what I always thought was a very insidious little thing of their enlistment. It says 3 years or for the war. So, okay, could be 5 years, could be 10 years. Of course, in the last decade, we've pushed the concept of how long the war should last far beyond its normal consideration. Most of the people were white males from the age of 18 to 35. The youngest man that I ran across was a young man from Wisconsin who was 14 and passed the height by tiptoeing up, and I guess he was a farmer from Wisconsin making cheese and milking cows, so they looked like a grown man to them. And the oldest man that I ran across was one of the Barkers over in Cisco, who lied about his age. He signed up, he said he was 44. Turns out he was 54. And he fought for 5 days at Gettysburg. Reported to the hospital because he was exhausted, debilitated, run down. And they flipped through the records and they said, well, the reason why he was exhausted, he finally confessed that he had lied to get in. So I believe that the range is more, at least 14 to 54, not counting the generals and folks like that. The U.S. asked for 300,000 men for 3 years in one of their last calls for duty. I think there were 3 of them. They instituted a draft of their own in 1863, which was not well received, hence the draft riots in New York City that you may or may not have heard about. It was in a movie that wasn't horribly accurate, but it did have Cameron Diaz in it, so I watched it. And you have to be practical. But the end result of that is they instituted a draft and asked for like 1 million men, but the normal volunteering that took place because of the way the war was going, it really only ended up drafting maybe about 150,000 men in the North for the whole part of the war. It's really quite remarkable. Mostly a war of volunteers on both sides. Population in New York in 1860, but look at the numbers. They sent a tremendous number of men off to the war. They lost 46,000. The two states that lost the most men in the Civil War were New York and North Carolina, both over 46,000. And 19,000 of these were killed in action. One of the little pieces of interesting trivia in the Civil War is that for each man that was killed in action, 2 men died of disease. So you can kind of multiply that, and you see if you multiply times 3, it doesn't work out exactly right. Even I, with my poli-sci degree, can do that much mathematics. Now, a lot of discussion how many people went from Onondaga County. I put 10,000 to 16,000. I think it's probably like 11,500, 12,228, something like that. The only way we can know is if some fool like me makes 3,000 more trips to the National Archives and pulls out his camera and takes a picture of all the military records that are in the archives from every person that served in Onondaga County. Now, if I was 27 years old, I might be tempted, but I'm not. 86,500 people were in Onondaga County about that time. There's 145,000 people plus in Syracuse now, and 437,322 people in Onondaga County right now. Don't check that figure with your smartphone. Remember when I said that? Onondaga, Pastor Panic gets out there, gets the exact number. And at which point I said, before you ever give a talk these days, the first thing you need to do is confiscate all the cell phones, confiscate all the smartphones, confiscate anything that's going to go beep or make any kind of a noise, but particularly anything that's going to educate the public while you're speaking, because you can get in a really deep hole very quick. Baby's population was only 2,300. Now, the Civil War units were, you all recognize the names: Company Regiment, Brigade, Division, Corps. It's not the same now. They kept it simple, made the companies about 100 men, 10 companies to form a regiment. Some regiments were a little bigger because they added companies, because they had the men to do it. Syracuse Regiment, the 185th, General Snipers got a statue downtown near St. Joseph's. Went to the field with 785 men, but they were brigaded with a Pennsylvania regiment at the end of the war. It was put together in 1864, and they had like 1,178 men. So it was 780, 1,178, so they about 2,000 men. So it was kind of a brigade, even though it was only 2 regiments. At the surrender, April 14th, or is it April the 12th? Surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. 1 Georgia regiment surrendered. There were 3 men left. Only 3 of the men from the original regiment. All the replacements had all been killed, wounded, deserted, captured, whatever it was. But only 3 men out of what should have been 1,000 surrendered their flag. Not gladly. Brigades are the unit of maneuver that you see the most. They can have, as I said, anywhere from 2 to 6 regiments, but it's about 4,000 men, and they're commanded by a brigadier general, brigade, brigadier. Divisions, 12,000 men, basically 3 brigades, sometimes 2, sometimes 4. And the corps, which are the big selections, are as posted. This is for the Union regiments. The Southern regiments were slightly different in organization, especially with the corps. Companies and regiments were pretty much the same for everyone. The South organized their artillery brigades differently. They had fewer cannon per battery. I think it's 4, and the one had 6 cannon per battery. So there's little variations. But you must keep in mind that virtually all of the military men, the military professionals on the North and South, virtually all of them went to West Point or the Citadel or Norwich or something like that, and they most of them knew each other. They were classmates. Did not like going off to war. It's not like when we fought the Germans and the Japanese, since we only knew a handful of the Germans and Japanese. We knew everybody in this war. But that's the way everybody was organized. You probably don't get a chance to see a regiment Union regiment marching in the field. I happened to see one marching down the road one day. I took a photo of it for you. And this is just the beginning. As you can see, it's in Virginia in the summer, so they're not in a big hurry. And another shot I wanted to put in here, because you can see these fellows with the little red hats on. This is a Zouave regimental company that joined this large regiment. This is probably a brigade for the purposes of the exercise. This was the 140th reenactment, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. This particular Zouave outfit is kind of like light blue with what looks like Santa Claus caps on. One of the most unfortunate things about the Civil War from a cultural point of view is that the people most looked up to at this time, after the Crimean War and the wars in Europe, were the French, and the French had become enamored with the North African units with which they fought, and the North African units dressed like this. So the 5th New York, for instance, had a dark blue coat on, but they had these red fezzes and these red pants. Now, speaking as a Marine, when you go hide in the jungle, or you go to hide in the woods, you don't want to be wearing a red hat. And that's what happened, is these people started getting picked off in 1861, 1862. 1861 was particularly confusing because North and South, a lot of people admired West Point. They had been wearing gray uniforms because of a big fight with some of the Indians previous 4 years earlier. And everybody's military uniforms at the Citadel and Lexington, at West Point and Norwich and a few other places, were all the gray military cadet uniforms that we see today. So a lot of people went to war wearing gray, even though they were from the north. 12th New York Regiment from Onondaga County was on the right at Blackburn's Ford. A Massachusetts regiment was on the left wearing gray. Guys across the road were wearing gray. 33rd Virginia, over here on the right, that broke up the fight on that first day, were wearing blue. At Harper's Ferry in 1862, the war had been going on for 2 years. The South was running out of supplies. They took over the supply depot at Harper's Ferry. If you've been to Harper's Ferry, wonderful place to visit for about 1,000 reasons. If you've been to Harper's Ferry, you can imagine huge warehouses full of supplies there. So they got all these supplies. They downed all these blue coats. They went 17-mile march, one of the most incredible forced marches in military history, in my opinion. I got exhausted driving the damn thing. And they came in and piled in on the left flank of the Union Army after it crossed Burnside Bridge, which, curiously enough, was not named Burnside Bridge at that time. When the Union soldiers looked at it, they thought they were reinforcements because they were all dressed in blue, until they started shooting at them. They realized it was A.P. Hill coming up from Harper's Ferry. Now, these are the Onondaga regiments that are named, curiously enough, Onondaga regiments. As you can see, the numerical progression is such that the first Onondaga regiment is the 12th, the second is the 101st. Again, are you seeing the mathematics here? There's one thing wrong with this picture. I won't bother to ask you, because she knows the answer, and she's a spring button, will jump up and say it. So I'm not going to ask the question. 3rd, 4th, 6th. There is no 5th Onondaga regiment. I have looked in as many books as I can, and I've come to the conclusion that I'm going to have to read these 19th century tomes that are 843 to 1128 pages long, and I know that in there is going to be one sentence, maybe two, that explains why there's no 5th Onondaga regiment. My guess is somewhere around the 160s or the 170s, some politician said, I'm forming a regiment. Good, you can be the 5th Onondaga regiment, and then you can come up with the men, the money, or the people to fill out the regiment. So they said, okay, to hell with you. I'm not going to give you a number because you can't come up with it. But in the meantime, General Sniper and a few other folks had filled out the 185th. So They committed to a 6th Onondaga Regiment, even though there is no 5th. Remember these names. Now, this is down in our Onondaga County Clerk's office. We were able to preserve one of the few counties that have their own flags. Most of them are in Albany, for various reasons. We were able to preserve ours through the good work of the 122nd New York reenactors and 12th reenactors of you guys and Onondaga Civil War Roundtable and Pat Stepanek and this young lady right here and Dorothy D'Angelo. Dorothy D'Angelo's going to be everything. Yeah, in fact, this cane used to be Dorothy D'Angelo's. This is the cane that she used to walk with when she used to walk the battlefield with General Sickle when Mount Monuments were going to be shortly in 1866, 67, 68. I actually said that to her in front of her. She thought it was pretty good. Now, what they did with the national flag is they listed, as time went by, which battles they fought in. I won't go into it, but Fort Stevens right here is a fort in D.C. You go up 14th Street, you go 16th Street really, and you get up to Fort Stevens, and Jubal Early came in 1864 and was attacking the city of Washington. Abraham Lincoln went out there and came under fire, and the unit that pushed the rebels back was the 122nd New York. So to the extent that you want to feel proud about it, your county saved the nation's capital. This is the national flag of the 149th New York, which is a sister unit. It too is beautiful. Carried, I mean, you have to remember these things were carried in combat. You can see how frayed they are. I like this right here, this down here, by the Jewish ladies of Syracuse, September 1862. So that's a nice touch, I think. There was one Jewish chaplain in the New York regiment. Everyone in the regiment was Christian, but they liked the guy, so they voted him to be the chaplain. It's the 52nd one, I think, which I think is a nice touch. These are the other units you won't hear about. You may have heard about the Syracuse Wasps and the Butler Swabs that were really kind of like militia guys before the war, and we got turned into one company of the 3rd New York Regiment. Was one of the first regiments. They did good work at Big Bethel. They were in one of the first fights in June of 1861. 2 men killed, 6 or 7 wounded. So, but this was just one company. The 61st New York is very, very interesting to you people in Fabius, because you can go to Tully and Atisco. There are no 61st New York people buried there. You go up to Pompey, you'll see a few. Lafayette, maybe 1 or 2. The rest of Syracuse, no 61st New York people. For reasons I have not yet figured out, I think it has to do with the Germans. Eugen Debby, who we meet later, and a couple of others, came here to this Fabius area for whatever reason from Hamilton and Madison County. Came over here and essentially recruited pretty close to a company from this area. These folks were in Company I, about 38 of them in Company I, 2 in Company C, and 6 in Company G. And we'll introduce you to the Rowley family, Cassius and Orson. In a few minutes, they were both in Company G. Company C in the 61st New York was made up entirely of students from Madison University, which is now Colgate University, and a couple of sprinklings of people from here and there, 2 of them from Fabius. The man by the name of Charles Fuller from the 61st New York wrote one of maybe the 5 or 6 best personal accounts of his experience in the Civil War, North and South, by anybody. And it was about his service in the 61st New York. It is really a remarkable piece of work. It can be downloaded for free if you go to archives.org on your computer. It's not very long. 75th New York had 129 Onondaga people. I don't believe anybody from Fabius or our area down here. The 111th New York is the Cuyahoga County Regiment. They were on the far right defending the ridge when Pickett charged. They were opposite the North Carolina guys in Trimble's division. There's 43 Syracusans that signed up in the Cayuga County Regiment. Now, you're going to see this in reality. If you draw a circle outside of Madison County, the people outside Madison County, some of which were from Onondaga County, went joined Madison County units and vice versa. Cayuga joined Onondaga regiments and vice versa. You know, the distance between Auburn and Syracuse is the same now as it was then. So that area in between the two of them, you know, everybody signed up with their family and friends and their relatives. So you might have two cousins that are from Syracuse, you go and sign up with them. It's very, very hard to figure it out from the social and the cultural point of view. Portland County, 76th and 57th, New York had about a half dozen Fabius people in both of them. These are both Portland County regiments. The 76th defended the railroad cut on the first day at Gettysburg. The 157th was over by the Ford dealership that they just tore down on the right, giving support to the battery, Ohio battery at that time. The 157th New York got cut up real bad. They had about 450 men, and they turned to face 3 Georgia regiments. So they're already outnumbered 3-1. When 3 more came from this way, and they cut them up real good. And one of my wife's relatives, Simeon Rainbow, who is indeed a relative of the famous philosopher and raconteur Blanche Rainbow, whom I'm sure you all have met, was killed outright, as were a great number of men from the 157th. Great regiment, tremendously brave that day because they knew exactly what they were getting into. They were this high up in the weed. 176 New York, don't know much about it. We had 10 Fabius people in it. 54 from Syracuse. They ended up going down and spending most of their time in New Orleans in 63 after they took it over. And then they got involved in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns at the end of the war in 1864 and played an interesting role, I have been led to believe, in the Battle of Cedar Creek, which is probably the single most beautiful location to go to observe a battlefield. Wonderful old plantation house there. Begins with B, Belvedere. It's fantastic to see. It's really easy to get to. You go over here to Route 81, you turn left, you drive for 8 hours, get off, and you're there. It's no problem. Now, the 61st New York, I'm hitting this hard for several reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is that it's considered to be one of the top 300 regiments in the Union Army. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They did incredible service, which is, I guess you might say they were very lucky or very unlucky to be in the wrong place or the right place at the right time or the wrong time. But it's a very, very tough outfit, very, very good outfit. This is their national flag that they carried until March of 1863, and this is their regimental flag. Again, presented by the city of New York, because the majority of companies were from east, were from New York City and from the Hudson Valley. Basically one company was from Onondaga County, and then one company came mostly from here. So very interesting to try to figure that out. Now these are the other units that you may hear about, both artillery and cavalry. The top one is famous. That's the 1st New York Light Artillery, Battery B from Baldwinsville, New York. Now at Gettysburg, they ended up over on the left of the line and played a very important role there, but they also, a year earlier at Fredericksburg, were called upon to take out 2 or 3 of the southern batteries across the Rapidan River in Fredericksburg that were taking pot shots at the Union troops as they came up in late November and early December to get ready for the Battle of Fredericksburg. So as the pontoon boats arrived. We've been corrected. It's not pontoon boats, it's ponton boats. Well, you know, I'm not going to argue with Ed Bars. If he wants to make it ponton, it'll be ponton. Anyway, they were very famous, and that was well over 100 men from the Syracuse area. Now, again, The 9th New York Heavy Artillery is Cayuga County Regiment. They started off as an infantry regiment, and somebody said, well, we got too many of infantry regiments, we need a heavy artillery regiment. They spent the first couple of years of the war guarding the forts around Washington, D.C. There were 60, at the height of the war, by 63, 64, there were 63 or 64 forts around Washington, D.C. because it was under threat. And these guys would man the forts, trained in artillery and in infantry, so they knew how to march and clean their rifles and do all the basic stuff like that. And it had well over 300 people from Onondaga County. When May 1864 rolled around, General Grant says, I don't need any bodyguard in forts up there because the entire Southern Army is down here in the South. So put your 90-inch Parrott guns away and get that Springfield rifle or an Enfield, if that's what they gave you, and march south and join us because we sure like to have you be infantry. So for things like Spotsylvania, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, horrible, horrible battle, maybe the worst battle we've ever fought. Harris Farm right afterwards, Cold Harbor, North Anna, Petersburg, the breakthrough at the end, the Five Forks battles, all those battles. There's countless heavy artillery regiments marching out there back and forth, and they're all infantry. They're not artillery. The 16th, again, 120 from Auburn, 141 from Syracuse. Nobody from Fabius or Cisco or Pompey that I've been able to find. In the cavalry regiments, the 2nd New York Cavalry was everybody but us for most of the war, and then they formed 3 companies when they started running out people in 1864. So all the cavalry stuff that goes on with the 2nd New York Cavalry in the late 1864, 1865, the last year and a half, got a lot of folks from our area in it. 10th New York Cavalry, one of my favorites, 70 people from Syracuse, a lot of folks from Portland County. But keep in mind what I told you at the beginning about my mother-in-law. Not only did I have to find out about Jacob Jacoby, but her mother was Cora E. Albro. So I had to find out about the Albro family, which is, frankly, my favorite family. I even like them better than mine. The Albros had 4 men in Company L of the 10th New York Cavalry. They're all from Cairo. If you go down there, there's 3 graves down there to 3 of the men named Albro, and a little monument to the 4th. He was killed at Battle of Hawes Station, which is northeast of Richmond, and was killed in May of 1864 in a very interesting battle because, again, the cavalry charged once, but they also dismounted and acted as infantry with the Sharps rifles, so a higher rate of fire than a muzzle-loading rifle. But a father, Philon R. Albro, was killed there. His son, Ezra J. Albro, continued on with the charge and was accompanied by his uncle and his cousin. Because the man that I admire most is James Albro. He married a woman by the name of Sabra Morris down here in Kyler, had 16 children. Sabra, not unsurprisingly, died, and 2 years later he married another woman, had another 11 children. Something like that. It's high in the teens. This meant that his eldest son got married and had children, and his eldest son's son, when he was born, was the same age as his youngest son. So the 2 of them were side by side in Company L. One was the uncle, and the other one was the uncle of the son. Yeah, half brother. It's very confusing. It looks really good. If I were to project the family tree, of course it'd be not that size. It makes sense when you look at it and say, oh. Anyway, Simon Morse was a descendant of Luther Morse, who lived here. He was a descendant of a whole bunch of other people. When you trace the family back, it turns out that my wife's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, drum roll, William Bradford, founder of the Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony, came over on the Mayflower. And who's the other person that has the same chain of command, the same family history? Ashley Judd. So I'm thinking, could I have a wife, could I have an athlete, Ashley Judd? I don't know where I went wrong. But I was born and raised next to Burbank in Glendale, California. So I'm an native-born California. What do I know? 15th New York Cavalry is very funny because the 12th New York Infantry was a 2-year regiment. They had some men that signed up later, didn't look at the piece of paper, signed up for 3 years instead of 2. But most of them got out after 2 years. And they said, we're not done fighting. The war's still on. It's 1863. What do you say we get together and form our own cavalry unit? Which they did. They became the 15th New York Cavalry. And they went out there, and when you look at the history of the New York Cavalry, the first 20 pages are hilarious because it seems that none of these farmers from upstate New York ever bothered to get on a horse to actually ride it. So these guys are throwing the saddles on, they're riding off, and the saddles are falling off. They didn't hitch them up because they didn't have saddles when they rode them, out of the barn and back. So that was pretty funny. But this cavalry unit ends up at Appomattox Station April 6th, right at the end of the war. They made the last big cavalry charge of the war right down the main street of Appomattox Courthouse, during which Augustus I. Root, the commander, lieutenant colonel, was killed. And the Syracuse GAR post is named after him up in Syracuse, because he was one of the lost officers killed in the war. 22nd New York Cavalry, we had 3 companies, again in 1864, similar to the 2nd Cavalry. A lot of folks from, I think there's 24 folks, probably wrote it down here somewhere, from Fabius were, not 24, a dozen to 15, 16, 17 folks were in the 22nd New York Cavalry. Some of these guys went in the infantry and then got out and after 2 years joined the cavalry. Curiously enough, I haven't seen a single case of a cavalry soldier getting out and joining the infantry. It was always the other way around. Now, I'm not going to go into these guys very much with you, but I'll tell you about the 24th New York Cavalry. They fought dismounted as infantry for like the first 1.5 years to almost 2 years in the war. And then the last year, they got on their horses. They finally got issued horses. So they started off as infantry and then became actual cavalry, even though they were a cavalry regiment right from the start. So you see 24th New York Cavalry, quote unquote, dismounted. Now, about half of the infantry in Texas were dismounted cavalry soldiers because they didn't have any horses. And they were shown as being the 11th Texas Cavalry dismounted for the entire war. They never got the horses. And nobody from this area was in that one. This is just a quick shot, because you see, you hear the term lines of battle facing each other. This is a Union line of battle. It's essentially 2 ranks of men, in some cases firing over the shoulder of the man in front of them, facing, and this would be a regimental front, so it might be 100, might be 150 men stretched out in a line of battle, facing a Confederate line of battle during the reenactment there at Spotsylvania. Skirmishers. I want to do a little tactics really quick. This just tells you what a skirmisher is and what it does, what their jobs are. It's a very important job in the Civil War and today. I mean, it's a position that has been held forever, particularly when a column is moving across land in an open field. The skirmishers are out further on the side, and they're out further in front, and they're spread further apart. When you get into the woods or the jungle, they might only be as far away as this, guarding your flank. They stay close so you can communicate with one another. But those are the jobs that they have. This is what, again, courtesy of some Confederate reenactors in Spotsylvania, they They're probably a little bit too close together to be in the open, but that's about where they would be when they started going through the woods, so they're probably getting ready to get into that position right now. This is the same concept of skirmishers in front of the main body of troops. They obviously have not started moving in the attack at Spotsylvania, but they'll start moving out, and then the other ones will come in, and that's just to keep the element of surprise away from them. On the flanks, cavalry. So you've got Confederate line of battle moving over here, a line of company moving over there on the right, and the cavalry over the right flank, again, to make sure there's no surprise. Nice looking horses too. This is firing by rank. This is the standard maneuver of infantry from Champlain in 16, whatever, all the way through the 1700s, all the European battles, all the way up through the Civil War, and for those foolish enough to try it, even after the Civil War. It worked because originally they had just straight muskets, in this case rifled muskets, if you will. The range of the old Brown Bess musket, which was the dominant firearm for about 50, 60, 70 years, was accurately maybe 50 yards, 100 feet, 150 feet at the most. But you'd be pretty sure of hitting somebody if they were 100 feet away, and you had a very, very good chance of hitting them if they were 50 feet away. But if you got together in a group like this, and you fired by rank, and you fired all at once, you put a whole wall of bullets flying down range, you got a good chance of hitting somebody. The problem is that yet these tactics during the Civil War, even though these new Springfield and Enfield rifles were capable of doing the same thing, but hitting somebody accurately 300 feet away, a football field length, or 2 football field lengths. They were very accurate rifles because they were rifled. Instead of having round balls, they had a spherical cone that made out of lead that bought into the rifling inside the musket, spin down range, and you could actually accurately hit what you were shooting at. So about 1863, everybody figured this out on their own, and they stopped standing up in the open like this. They started getting down behind piles of rocks and logs, or they used their cup and their plate, tin plate for an entrenching tool. Every regiment had axes with them and spades with them, a dozen, 2 dozen spades, to do really heavy trench work. But a lot of times, as you know, if you've been in the military, the supply line didn't exactly catch up with the troops in the front. Now this is where the term rank and file comes from. These are the files, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the ranks are like this, the files are like this. The British perfected rank firing very well in the 1870s. These were 3 ranks. The first one kneeling, the second one standing, and the third one standing on perhaps a bale of hay or cotton or logs, and firing by rank. It's only done once or twice in the entire Civil War. Most of the time you just open fire. I thought I'd talk to you about one guy in particular. I'll do this a couple times going on. Samuel Crowfoot. First of all, he's got a great name. Does anybody know Crowfoot around here? There's got to be a few of them. You take a good look at what he did. He signs up in May of 1861. So he went with the first Onondaga, down to the Washington, D.C. area. We marched across the Long Bridge, better known now as the 14th Street Bridge, from D.C. to Virginia on May the 23rd, 1861. And that unit that marched across that bridge was the 12th New York, but it was the 12th New York militia that were down there for just 3 months. This was the 12th New York Infantry Regiment of Volunteers, many of whom had been in the 12th New York militia. It's very confusing. They get there in time to fight in the First Manassas Battle. But they weren't in the First Manassas Battle because their job was to fight at Blacksburg's Ford a couple of days ahead of time. They got in a big dust-up again with the guys in gray from Massachusetts to their left and the guys in gray across the way. And he went through that at that time, which I think was pretty good. Then he gets out in late September and immediately joins the 61st New York. He came back here to Fabius, and the Fabius recruiters were in here for some reason, and recruited, by the way, the canteens did not look like this during the they were much rounder and made out of tin or wood. So he joins the 61st New York. He goes down there on June the 30th and gets wounded at White Oak Swamp, which is also known as White Oak Creek. Depends on where you were in the swamp, I guess. Gets wounded on June the 30th. Then I guess he goes to the hospital for a while, or maybe he just limps around. But he was in bad enough shape that he got discharged, but not until after the Battle of Fredericksburg. So June the 30th and the rest of the 7th, Malvern Hill and a couple of other things, and a march up to Fredericksburg. He fights the Battle of Fredericksburg on December the 13th, more than probably. I don't have his record, so I'm not sure. But it's a good chance he could get it. He gets out. Then he goes home and starts feeling better. This happened to a lot of guys. So then he joins the 22nd New York Cavalry. In December, I think like the 10th, just about a year later, of 1863. But he doesn't get discharged until August of 1865. So Samuel Crowfoot, bless his pea-picking heart, bless his soul, May 1861 to August of 1865 served during the entire Civil War with a little bit of time out in between. Now, this is the one I told you about earlier. See, this is North. I have to write a letter to the Civil War Trust. So if you imagine, turn the James River so that it's actually flowing up like it was, like that, and this is Richmond, and all this action is really to the east and southeast. But I think the point is nevertheless made that from June the 25th to July the 1st of 1862, including our friend Samuel Crowfoot, and I should mention at the Battle of Several Pines, there was Hiram Cadogan, Henry Lawrence, and Orrin Allen. Are there any Cadogans around these days? Cadogan, Lawrence, and Allen of Company I of the 61st New York were all killed at that Battle of Fair Oaks. So these things were very, very serious encounters. They basically struck down here at Beaver Dam Run, and it's a series of fights in late June. Gaines's Mill is perhaps the most devastating one and one of the most interesting ones. I thought about putting the Gaines's Mill map up here for you to see, but you know that one I showed you earlier? Gaines's Mill is twice as complicated as that. But the 61st New York was really involved in that fight, along with the 101st New York from Onondaga County. So you had about 50 Fabius and Pompey men in the 61st New York, and right near them was the 101st New York from Onondaga County, which was almost entirely Onondaga men. And they were fighting, not exactly side by side, but pretty damn close to each other. Savage's Station turned out to be well-named. Glendale, or also known as Frazier's Farm, which is very confusing because one part of the Battle of Saratoga is Frazier's Farm, so that's probably why they stuck with Glendale. Very significant battle there, and here's our friend, the White Oak Swamp / Creek. All of this peters out into Malvern Hill. Now, curiously enough, at Malvern here, the first Onondaga, the 12th New York, was kind of over on the left with the 44th New York and a couple of other regiments that always served with. They were also down here at Gaines's Mill. Gaines's Mill was cool because there was a Bosun Creek run along, and the 12th, there was a regiment, 2 regiments in front of them, and then the hill went up at like 25 degrees slope, so they walked like 15 feet up the hill, and they dug a little trench, and without any problem at all, they could shoot across the creek and not hit their own guys in the head, which was frowned upon even in those days. And then you go up another 15 feet, there was another line of regiments. When you look at it on the map, it's like this line of regiments goes all the way over here, then there's a second line, and then the third line, and all I can think about is coming out of the woods over there with the Confederate sign, and looking up at that. It must have been frightening. So instead of having one rank line of battle firing at you, they had 3 lines of battle stacking up firing at them. Needless to say, the Confederates did not gain the ground in this battle, but General Lee was leading. They basically pushed the Union Army back over here to Melbourne Hill and back up to Harrison's Landing and pushed them right back onto the James River. 50% of that was really tough fighting on their part and wonderful leadership by General Lee, and the other 50% was that McClellan was an outstanding staff officer and supply officer and organizer. He couldn't command in the field for some reason. He was 38 years old. He should have been able to figure this out. And the troops were really, really upset when they marched from Malvern Hill, because they just, that was one of Lee's biggest mistakes, Malvern Hill, attacking that hill, which, as Pat Stepanic points out, is just a little slope. But when you're standing up there and you're looking down the hill, why did they assault that? I don't know. But they kind of lost this battle, but McClellan retreated. So this whole big dust-up, the 7 days, saved Richmond. The war could have been over right then and there. Now comes the Raleigh family. Cassius and Orson are cousins. I first thought they were brothers. But Cassius was only 18. He signed up with Company G. There were, again, 6 men in Company G from this area. Most of the Fabius people, 33, 35, 36 of them were in Company I. He gets wounded at that Glendale battle I pointed out to you. Discharged for disability on November 30th at Annapolis, which was a major staging area then as it is now. But the battles that he went through were very significant. Maybe about 5 battles before halfway through the 7 days. So it's not as if nothing happened to him. You can't see this very well, but I just want to show you the handwriting of what the documents look like when you look at the National Archives. Certificate of Disability for Discharge. And it goes through a lot of really, Cassius Raleigh. These guys really had good cursive handwriting. I'm sure all of them got through grade school. Which with handwriting like that, which none of us could. And it goes into it a great deal of detail. Now, just look at that and think in terms of an enlistment paper being, kind of like it's got the same eagle up there, volunteer enlistment, but there's something I want you to hear on this enlistment paper after I get some water. Am I going on too long? We only have the room until midnight. And I've got, after all this is done, I've got at least 2 hours of shows if you're interested. Well, I know that you two will leave because you've heard them all. The thing that's fascinating is apparently in 1860 and 1861, they had enlistment papers. And people got enlisted. Like I said, there was 100,000 to 300,000 that signed up for the North and for the South. And I'm sure they had enlistment papers. They changed the enlistment papers in 1862, sometime in 1862. So each enlistment paper has 2 certifications on it. One is by the doctor, and get a physical. You had to have 2 teeth. These 2, opposite each other, so you could pull the paper off to load the weapon. Didn't care if you had any other teeth, you had to have those 2. And it had to be the 2 on the right. Then you had to have some other things like a trigger finger, feet, hands. Very, very, very skimpy physical exam. So the guy certifies this guy's able to serve. But then the recruiting officer has to sign this form here. Here's what it says. I certify on honor that I have minutely inspected the volunteer previously to his enlistment, and that he was entirely sober when enlisted. That to the best of my judgment, believe he is of lawful age and and that accepting him as duly qualified to perform his duties as a able-bodied soldier, I have strictly observed the regulations, blah, blah, blah. I thought it was significant, entirely sober was the first thing they mentioned. So you have to wonder, you know, those first units that volunteered and came out, it's like the guy that wakes up with 16 tattoos after he goes on his first liberty at the base in San Diego. Kind of wonder. Let me pass this around for everybody to take a little gander at it. This happens to be a fellow from the 9th New York Heavy Artillery by the name of Woodruff. And he's from Fabius. In fact, even though it was almost clear across the county to kind of the regiment. And then this one is Julius Babcock, of the famous Babcock family. If you go over to the cemetery, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the people buried in the cemetery at Evergreen are named Babcock. There's the widow Babcock, who's got like 6 relatives buried there. Her husband died, 2 girls died, 3 sons went off to the war. This one was captured at the Battle of the Wilderness with the 140th New York, which was a Zouave regiment dressed in the fancy clothes, and one of the finest regiments that we had, equal to the 61st New York, made a desperate attack up an incline there and got waxed. And he got captured, wounded and captured, and then went off to prison and ended up at Andersonville. And he died of scurvy in Andersonville. Scorbutus, they called it. They had no fresh vegetables and no fresh oranges. Be sure to see the movie. They did a good movie on Andersonville a few years ago. But then the other 2 fellows in the Babcock family, one was in another regiment, did good service, nothing special. But the other one was in a Pennsylvania regiment, which is strangely enough, and he had his own Pennsylvania story to tell, which somebody from Pennsylvania can tell because I'm doing Vegas. Eugene Deming was the commander of Company I. You want to say Eugene, but it was Eugen. It's the German spelling. And he was a very good officer. I read quite a bit about him and the unit at that time. And he was spoken highly of by everyone. And again, our old friend, the White Oak Swamp. Leg amputated in the field. They had to leave him behind. He was captured. And he was taken to POW back to Richmond. They did the best they could. But as you see, June 30th to July the 20th, he didn't make it. Now, I've got a couple of documents of him. I have a very, very, very faded version of the carte de vis, the baseball card photo that is pictured here. And I have to donate that and a couple of other things to the New York Military Museum. I was asked to do it, and I will do it in honor of, excuse me, in behalf of Charlie Shea, who gave it to me to take care of. So I will take care of it. Gettysburg. Everybody loves Gettysburg. Let me know if I'm going too long for anybody. This is the 111th at Gettysburg. I love this photo because I took it, and I got a shadow here, and I think it's cool. And this is our friends from Baldwinsville, Battery B, New York Heavy Artillery. I believe that the gunner on this particular piece was named Alec Baldwin, but I'm not sure. You mentioned the 12th New York, 1st Onondaga Regiment, all the stuff they went through. They had 2-year men, but they also had a good portion, about 2 companies of 3-year men, who were less than pleased when everybody else went home and they weren't allowed to. Hey, read the fine print, man. You signed up for 3 years. These guys had only signed up for 2 years. Oh, well, read the fine print. There's a problem way back then. So this unit ended up being a very small battalion, like 2 companies, but they were the provost guard at Gettysburg, up at that White House that Richard Anderson walks into and says, by God, I hope this is good ground. If you've seen the movie of Gettysburg, General Meade, playing General Meade, So they were in the back there guarding the house. And of course, when the 150 guns from the Confederates fired over everybody else, the shells landed back in the middle of the 12th New York, which I'm sure they appreciated. I just saw this posted in the field by the 61st New York reenactors. You can tell I took a photo because I got some of the houses in Sherburne and behind it. But I thought it was cool, so I put it up there. This is nice. It's the 61st New York monument at Gettysburg in the wheat field. But I wanted you to see that this is the direction that the 61st was coming towards. And they got about 1/3 of the way into the wheat field, which is gently sloping about a 3 to 5 degree angle down towards the trees where the Confederates were hiding. And this is the wood to the left. This is fairly accurate as far as showing you how level it was, except the wheat was about 2 feet, 3 feet high in July. I don't know if they had done previous cutting or not, but it was wheat, so I think it grows later. So it was about at least knee high when the actual battle occurred. Now, bear with me with this one. This is the 61st New York coming into the wheat field and moving across the road to that position they eventually occurred. The photo is about their midway position, right here in the middle of the wheat field. Georgia, South Carolina regiments coming up. This is the phase at 6:20 to 7 o'clock at night. This field had already been fought over 3 times, maybe 4 times. In the space of half a day, there were 4,000 men killed and wounded on this field. I'm not counting missing, 4,000 killed and wounded on this field. When the 61st New York went into this field, they were supposed to have, if you recall, Yorktown, when Gurdon Hurlbut and Jacob Jacoby was with the 61st New York. Everybody got sick, so their 1,000 men were only 750 when they left New York in the first place. And then they were down there for a month and a half, and had a couple of little fights at Williamsburg and a couple other places where they got the 7 Pines. And then they got in the whole dust up at 7 days. They went up to spit it out, Courtney. I used to live there. Second Manassas. They went up to Second Manassas and went from 750 to about 385 until we walked into the field at Antietam. They were in the Bloody Lane here at the cornfield at Antietam. They had 93 riflemen. They had, in fact, Fuller says, we had a sufficient number of officers to staff an entire regiment, but they didn't have the men. So they had a whole bunch of officers and senior enlisted men backing up the men, and he said, you know, if one of the guys drops, I'm going to pick up the rifle and join the ranks. They had to. They fought right here. Right next door, Kelly, Irish Brigade, 69th New York, the Irish Brigade, recruited in Syracuse. 7 men were in the 69th New York. 7 men from Syracuse were in the Irish Brigade. 2 of them were actually from Ireland to Canada to Oswego and signed up in Syracuse. And Dennis Doyle was killed in this field, right next to the other men that fought with the 61st. Dennis Doyle was the great-great-great-grandfather of Ed McAuliffe, who lives over in Marcellus. And he's only to do this the next time I go to the archives. So that'll be interesting to read about him. 93 men walked into the field, 35 walked out. Almost the same statistics as happened at Antietam. They had about 90, a little over 90 rifles. Supposed to have 700. 35 guys walked out. A year later, same thing happens to them in the wheat field. Again, you can see how complicated these things are. That's a little thing about Orson. Peninsula, Second Manassas, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. Finally wounded at Charles City Courthouse in 1864. One of the sad things about the Gaines's Mill thing, I won't show you the map, but it's down here, just south of Cold Harbor. And 2 years later, Cold Harbor takes place. And that happened twice, big time. Once at Chancellorsville and the Wilderness, it was a year apart. So when the soldiers fought in the wilderness in 1864, they went through woods and were tripping over skeletons left over from the previous year. They would have to camp in the grounds where other units had camped among skeletons, and they'd push them aside, as you can imagine. And then the same thing happened down here. And he was discharged for disability in 1864. He comes home and he gets married. He has Giles and Charles and a daughter whose name escapes me at the moment. And he gets buried right over here in Evergreen Cemetery. So Cassius and Orson are both over here in Evergreen, about 75 feet from one another. And again, this is the Sherburne Cemetery where Charles Fuller of the 61st is buried. These are 61st reenactors, none of whom, one of whom is from the state of New York, mostly Pennsylvania and New Jersey. They love the 61st. But I thought that this covers it pretty well. Here we have the Union men paying